Hi everyone, welcome to In the Library. Yay! My name is Adaeze. I am the founder, researcher, lead curator, whatever you want to call it, really, of In the Library. And yeah, I'm excited to have everyone be part of this, although not live, but still be a part of this conversation. So today we'll be kicking off our Behind the Pen series. Um, and Behind the Pen series is where we get into in-depth conversations with authors of some of our favorite books, some of our newly discovered books. But the point is really to fully understand the process of writing, inspiration behind the book or books, um, understand characters, understand themes, and also speak to how most of the time, our culture, society, um, life situations inspire some of the things we read and how we as readers also tap into it to relate more and can relate more rather with these things we read in books. But I'm excited to be kicking this off with Adorah Nworah, who is the author of the book Housewoman. Housewoman is Adorah's debut novel. Before this, she's been writing short stories. First thing that caught my attention, the book cover, but more so the genre of the book, which is thriller. Personally, I've never read any African literature that falls on the thriller genre. So when I saw that, I was very excited. I read the plot. I was like, okay, good. And then I got the book, and mind blown. Everything from the characters to the plots to the themes, even to lessons and certain quotes to protagonists to the cliffhanger. Everything made me so excited, and I truly want to hear from Adora. What inspired this book? It is crazy. It is really crazy. So Adora will be joining us for the first ever Behind the Pen series. If you cannot tell, I'm super excited for this. Again, I've never done this before, where I've had to go live or where I've had to speak to anyone via video for in the library. So this is going to be happening, I hope, as often as possible. But yeah, so join me at I welcome Adora. Hi, Adora.
Hello, hi.
I'm so happy. I'm so happy to have you on this. Thank you so much for agreeing to be the first person that we're doing this behind the pen series with. I think I'm just super excited. First of all, it is such an amazing thing to be an author and then to be a young African author in this day and time. I am so honored to know you. Oh my God, hello to your cat,
I
your dog.
know, like my cat just made his appearance. Hi,
Hi.
my name is Beans.
Oh, hi. Yes, so I'm super
Um,
excited to be doing this with you and just to get into
mhm,
conversation with you, in-depth conversation about the book, about writing, and also just like several things, in regard to
mhm,
culture, society, and just how, all these things play a key role in our creativity and how much, we're able to put out there as
mhm.
creatives, but of course for you as an author. So please tell us more about yourself. Let everyone get to know you. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me. When you reached out, I knew that I wanted to participate in this because you don't always get the opportunity to talk about literature with a fellow young Igbo woman. So I jumped at the opportunity. It was also great talking to you last week. So
Yeah.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for a minute.
Same.
So
Same.
like you said, my name is Adora. I am currently based in Philadelphia, but I am Nigerian. I'm Igbo from Anambra State. And I've always been writing for as long as I can remember. I started really writing in secondary school. I went to Queen's College in Lagos, and I
Oh.
would write. Yes, I would write to entertain myself. I didn't take it seriously, but friends would read it and would always want me to complete a story. I never completed any of my stories because I'll get bored. And so it wasn't until I moved to the US for college and I took two creative writing classes and got really
Mm-hmm.
good feedback classmates and from my professor that I figured that I could actually, shoot my shots at being a published author.
Yeah.
So I started working on Housewoman in law school because I'm currently a lawyer, and so I had started law school. And I would work on it, but I wasn't taking it too seriously because law school was so busy. And it wasn't until I started practicing law in my first year of practice, because of how busy the job was and just how all encompassing it was. It felt super important for me at the time to carve out time for my writing. It almost felt like a self-care practice, just to have this quiet time divorced from the law, and divorced from feedback from anyone. Because with being a first-year lawyer, you're constantly getting feedback. And I just wanted to have this one solitary practice just to take out time for myself. And that's when I really started working on Housewoman. And I think at the time I got shortlisted for two writing competitions: the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, and the what's the other one? So bad that I'm for the Short Story Day Africa. I think I got longlisted for that, and I got some interest from literary agents. They reached out to
Mhm.
me asking if I was working on anything. So that gave me the ginger to complete Housewoman. Like, knowing that they were waiting for a full manuscript,
Yeah.
I was able to prioritize Housewoman because I knew that like the time was ticking. Like, I didn't want the fire to burn out and like for them to lose interest in the book. So I
Mhm.
completed Housewoman within my first year of practice, sent it to those agents and to a couple other agents. And that's how I ended up with my lovely literary agent in the US. Her name is Sharon Pelletier. She's based in New York and she's amazing. And the rest is history. She sent my novel out on submission. It was a long submissions process because it officially went out at the start of the pandemic. So it was just like a weird
Mhm.
time for literature, with like a lot of places, a lot of things just shutting down and publishers not wanting to take a risk. So
Yeah.
it was almost a full year of of submissions to publishing houses. So I kind of like gave up on Housewoman getting published. I started working on something else. And towards the end of the submissions process, we suddenly got two different publishers, one in the UK, one in the US, that were like seriously interested in acquiring Housewoman. And that's how I got my book deals.
Yo, that's actually amazing. I've heard different stories about people who want to get published but never really get to that point. So it's either they send the manuscript and it gets rejected,
Mhm.
or the entire process of, proofreading, editing just becomes so tedious, and everyone just like, yeah,
Mhm.
I'll rather not. I'll just stick to doing short
Mhm.
stories and posting online. So
Right.
once again, like massive congratulations on being a published author. Like Adora, that's such a huge
Yeah.
deal. And I'm sure
Thank
people watching this at some point will want to know as well what it takes to become a published author. So I feel like maybe that's another conversation we can have eventually, for young
you.
writers. But yeah,
Mhm.
so tell us, or tell me, or well, us,
Mhm.
the inspiration
Mhm.
behind the book, Housewoman. Because when I read the plot or the summary behind the book, I was like, oh, the synopsis. I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. This is really interesting.
Right.
But as I read
Mhm.
the book, it was so much more. It was
Mm.
a lot, you know. And I and I feel
So
like
much going on.
was a lot, and I feel like the summary behind the book doesn't even fully
Mm.
capture the essence of
The
the book in
essence.
itself. So
Yeah.
I'm just like,
Mhm.
girl, you need to tell us what was going on in your head when you were thinking of
Oh my
this.
God, it's so interesting because I've seen lots of reactions to the book, and like I think I saw one from some Nigerian book blogger about like, wow, like what is going on in this girl's mind? Like, it's so twisted. And in my mind, I was just writing a simple book. Like, I didn't even know it would have such a strong effect on a lot of people because I
Hmm.
guess my mind is twisted and I'm in it 24/7, so I don't realize. Um, and it's interesting that you mentioned that the synopsis or like the jacket thingy, the little summary, doesn't do it justice because the two sides, the US and UK sides, they have their own separate like summaries
Okay.
at the back. So I do think that the US side gets you closer to like the meat of the story, while the UK one kind of like dangles it. So it's interesting that there's that discrepancy there. But what was going on in my mind? So, like many young Nigerian women, I was just fed up with like the bullshit, the double standards. Like I think growing up in Nigeria and just seeing the way women in Nigeria, not just Nigeria, like this is something that affects a lot of patriarchal societies across the world, right? But as a Nigerian woman, just seeing the way women are socialized to groom themselves for marriage, right? Like to
Yeah,
be that person who is cooking in her father's house because what would you do in your husband's house, right? Like, you
exactly.
know, getting back home on time, like just the messages that are passed down to women, even from a really young age, that always rubbed me the wrong way. And I remember the inspiration for Housewoman coming to me while I was in Houston before I moved to Philadelphia for law school. I don't even know what prompted it exactly, but I know where I was. I was in the car with a guy friend, so he probably made some silly comments. And I was just like, it's so crazy how women are literally raised to prime and prep themselves for marriage. And I'm going to write a book about this, about a woman who was basically born to fulfill the
Yeah.
needs of, a spouse, right? Like a man, right? Down the line. And a woman who was socialized from birth to like her current day to,
Hmm.
be a wife for this man, right? Like
Literally.
literally born to live her
Yeah.
life for the man. So I felt like it would be a good premise for a thriller, like a social thriller, right? Because I feel like the thrillers, the works of horror that I'm most drawn to are
Hmm.
ones that draw from actual reality. I feel like real
Hmm.
life is up enough that there's enough material in our day-to-day life to write good horror stories. And at
Hmm.
the same time, I haven't really seen much of that in African literature. I mean, I had read My Sister the Serial Killer, which I really liked, but there were not as many works of social horror, thriller, whatever, at the time. So I wanted to, I thought it would be a good idea to plug that gap in the market by writing Housewoman. Yeah.
That is actually very interesting. And I love how you said she was literally born to fulfill the duty, the role of a wife. And that's
Mhm.
exactly what the protagonist was born to do. At some point, I was like, no, this babe was actually born to die.
Right.
It felt like a do or die affair. Like you're either going to be
Mhm.
a wife, be a mother, or you die in this
Right.
house. That was
Your
really what it
needs.
felt.
Right. And for me, obviously, like with House of Man, everything is
Hmm.
the stakes are really high. But my whole thing is when women are socialized to marry, to put the needs of their husbands first, it doesn't matter what your needs are. It doesn't matter whether you're literally dying in that marriage,
Yeah.
suffering from abuse. Like it doesn't matter what you're bearing, the messaging that a lot of women still
Hmm.
get from their loved ones, from people who are supposed to advocate for them is just persevere. Like I
Yeah.
did it, do it as well. So yeah, I wanted to play with that and obviously take it to extreme lengths with
Hmm.
Housewoman. Yeah.
And I'm glad you said so because I would also love us to sort of look at, the protagonist, Ikemefuna, and her mother-in-law, Agbala. It seems
Mhm.
like, as much as you're saying Ikemefuna was born to serve, be a wife, Agbala, on the other hand, who's a wife, isn't acting like the typical ideal Igbo wife or the
Mhm.
typical African woman. She seems more like the head of the family. She seems more like the
Mhm.
person, who's in control. But with that strength and that stubbornness, coconut head, like African friends would say, with that she has, there's also a bit of it in Ikemefuna. I mean, we got to see Ikemefuna, her story or her character progress from being sort of timid, sort of, I just want to please, to actually, yeah, like, no, you can't say this to me
Mhm.
without me reacting, So would
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
say both women are sort of cut from the same cloth, but not necessarily, because there was a lot
Mhm.
of friction between both, but
Right,
they are
right.
different, they
Yeah.
are similar. So it would be nice to also
Mhm.
understand both women. Yeah.
Right. No, I love that question. I definitely think there's a lot to unpack between the relationship with Agbala and Ikeme for now, both sides. And I look at Agbala as a member of the old guard, right? Like
Mm,
a woman who, in many ways, upholds the patriarchy in terms of like her relationship to Ikeme Fana and
mm-hmm.
wanting to keep Ikemefuna down, like wanting to make sure Ikemefuna stays in line.
Yeah.
And Ikemefuna is this young woman who's fighting for her freedom. And I think, even in Nigeria and like a lot of patriarchal societies, you see that dynamic between some older women, not all obviously, but like a lot of older women and like young women who are like doing their own thing. And the women are trying to put them in line, right? Like because
Yeah.
they or like they saw that growing up. But with Agbala, it's also interesting because she's not the typical, like you said, she's not the typical, woman in a patriarchal society that's been subdued and subjugated by her husband. And
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to play with this idea of how different women survive patriarchal societies, right? Like there are
Mm-hmm.
different tactics that are employed, and you could even bring Adina into the conversation, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
so, these three women, and there's a fourth woman, but the focus on these three women, right? Like, and the ways that they survived their lot. And for Agbala, her survival mechanism was being that loud mouth. Like even from when she was
Yeah.
younger, she was vocal. She was big on like being the one out of her sisters that stood out enough to have this title of the mouthpiece of a god, right? And
Yeah.
she was even strategic about her choice of a partner, right? Like going for a man like Eke that she knew she could dominate, right? Like, so she was very intentional. And you see women like that in patriarchal societies who are very intentional about positioning themselves,
Yeah.
strategically enough where they don't have to deal with some of like the worst parts of patriarchy. And they're
Yeah.
not always, you think that women like that would like, raise women who would be fighters or whatever. But sometimes those women also are the biggest upholders of the patriarchy. It's kind of like, organizations where there are very few women at the top, but the women at the top are like men. Like they're
Yeah.
just feel the need to take on the worst traits of like the men in power because they feel like that gives them a seat at the table. So I wanted to mold Agbala into someone like that, right? Like she survived the patriarchy by carving out a position of power for herself, but she's using that position of power to be like many other patriarchal like men, misogynistic men, right? Like so
Yeah.
that's the last thing. And Ikeme Funa is your typical like fighter. Like, yeah, she started off timid, but she continued to draw strength from within her, right? Like, she continued to fight till the very last minute. And I think when people have their backs to the wall, you never know, what they would do. So you could be the most timid person, but when you're forced into a position where you have to fight, then
Mm-hmm.
it brings out parts of yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also
Mm-hmm.
think someone like Adina, right? Like on paper, you may be easy to dismiss her as someone who did not fight enough, but
Yeah.
I would never, like for me, surviving looks different for different people, right? Like, and we talk about women who are abused and oh, why didn't she leave? But a lot of women who leave are killed by their spouses, right? Like,
Yeah.
so for some people, surviving means playing dead. Like, surviving means taking as much as you can if that would keep you alive for another day. And it may not
Mm-hmm.
fits well with like it may cause a lot of discomfort for a lot of people because it's like, oh, if you're survive, like if you want to, like you should push back, you should leave,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. But surviving, there's no one size fits all for survival, and people do
Mm-hmm.
what they can another day, and that's what Adina was doing. And she tried her best to look out for Ekeme Funa in the ways that she could she have done
Mm-hmm.
more arguable, debatable, but to the extent that she could, she tried to look out for Ikeme Funa. Yeah.
So would you say that again, because this is centered around Igbo people, so
Mhm.
Igbo culture plays a heavy role. And of course, we're both Igbo women, so it makes a lot of sense that we're also trying to have this conversation. So would
Right.
you say Igbo culture or the way marriage, first of all, the way women are seen in Igbo culture and the way marriage has been carved in the Igbo culture, played a role in the way one, Adina was subservient in her marriage, and then two, Agbala as the complete opposite of what the Igbo culture would say a woman should be or who a woman should be.
Mhm.
How does her, first of all, being the, so these are like several questions, but the whole point is the role of Igbo culture in
Mhm.
the thing called marriage, and also in the growth, development, and identity of women.
Mhm.
Because when we look at the book, the most impacted people in the book were Ikemefuna, Agbala, and Adina.
Adina really,
Mm-hmm.
because she did lose a child and
Mm-hmm.
basically was living with a man that couldn't care less if she saw the next morning. So to me,
Right.
three people did shape the
Mm-hmm.
story a lot. I mean, I know like, Na and Na did have a good role to play as well, but for the women in particular, especially because of Igbo culture, would you say the way everything is done in Igbo culture affected has affected the way each person acted in their own marriage? Let me put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Agbala was
Right.
different, Ikemefuna was different, Adina
Right.
was different. So would you say
Right.
that? Yeah. And
Yeah.
what part of the culture as well
Mm-hmm.
do you think, we need to tackle or we need to talk about now in modern society? Because obviously times and seasons are changing. So the way things were
Mm-hmm.
done before cannot be the same way things are done now.
Right, right.
Yeah.
No, that is an amazing question. Um, and yeah, so I think whenever I was writing House of Man, I wasn't necessarily thinking, oh, Igbo culture specifically in marriage. I was thinking more of patriarchal societies like
Hmm.
Nigeria. So I wasn't thinking this is specific to Igbo culture.
Right.
Does Igbo culture somehow perpetuate this in certain ways? Yes, definitely, definitely. So that definitely is a thing. But I wasn't thinking specifically to Igbo culture, right? Like I was thinking of Nigeria, but I also wanted to write a book that people from whatever patriarchal society could relate
Hmm.
to on some level, right?
Hmm.
And I don't think patriarchy is even unique to, developing nations. Even in the West, there are levels
Yeah.
to it. Maybe not be as jarring, but there are levels to it. I do think that there's a culture of silence when it comes to persevering in marriages that is something that you see in Igbo. It's hard because when I think of culture, I'm like, how much is this our culture? Or is this, people poisoning what? sh- Is this people poisoning? Like, I like to think of, and maybe this is me being overly idealistic, but when I think of like culture, and especially when it comes to the patriarchy, I'm like, is this our
Hmm.
culture? Or is this people who have poisoned what should have been different, right? So
Right.
I like to not think of it as Igbo culture, but I do think that there's a culture of silence that is still being perpetuated, right? Like I think of even when it comes to land ownership, home ownership, and the struggles women and Igbo women face, and even with
Yeah.
even with court rulings that now allow for women to own property in Igbo land. I still have family members who had to fight, Igbo family women in my family who had to fight after my grandfather died. And so all of these, I hear of stories, especially of women back in the East, right? Compared to like the women in Lagos, um, who are bearing and persevering grave hardships in their marriages, and
Yeah.
what mothers, like the people around them, the people who have positions of power, the women with positions of power in Igbo land are perpetuating, the narratives, the persevere. But at the same time, I like to not think of it as our culture. I like to think of it as I like to think of it as patriarchy as this epidemic that has, infiltrated a lot of cultures in Nigeria, around the world. And I hope that like people read. It's tricky because when you're writing as an African writer, as an Igbo writer, it's so easy for people to like take whatever and run with it. Like this is what all Igbo people are like, or
Hmm.
this. It's a tricky thing because it's like it's a real issue, and I
Yeah.
don't want to play that, but I also want to be clear that the patriarchy is not specific to Igbo culture. It is
Yeah.
certainly a thing, but it is something that people over the world deal with to varying
Hmm.
degrees.
Hmm.
And because of our culture of like, respect and whatnot, you want to, as a woman in Igbo culture, as an Igbo woman, especially if you're back in the East, it's probably
Hmm.
harder to walk away. It's probably harder to like have your voice. But at the same time, I do want to say that some of the most feminist, the most fearless women I know are Igbo women. And I think of like, I think of my mother and growing up. Did she call herself a feminist? Probably not, but I think most of my feminism comes from her. And so when I think of the relationship between Adina and Ikemefuna, Adina probably does not see herself as a feminist, but you pick up on little things like her conversation with Ikemefuna before Ikemefuna left for the US, where she's like, in the US, women are more vocal, like call
Yeah.
911 if you have to. So little things like that. I think of that. I can think of countless Igbo women who, growing up, I saw them as role models. And maybe they were persevering a lot of hardships in their marriages, but they would still pull you to the side and be like, don't take this. Like, I
Yeah.
remember auntie telling me, who was a housewife, telling me, never, ever, like always make sure you have your own money. And that was
Yeah.
something she had to deal with, but they were very clear on passing on messages like this. And so I think that informs Ikemefuna's strength. She may not have
Yeah.
seen Adina fighting fearlessly, but she still got the message. And, shout out to Igbo women for that.
Honestly, yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, especially the make sure you have your own money. That is something my mom rings
Mhm.
in my ear all the time. She's like, no, you're gonna have a
Right,
good job, you're gonna be
right,
working, you won't be
right.
stay.
Yeah, because they
Always
do.
emphasizing on independence.
Exactly. And sometimes it may be women who did not get to enjoy that, but they
Yeah,
know to pass on the message to their younger ones, to their daughters, and to
yeah,
hopefully correct that moving forward.
yes, yes. Thank you for explaining that. But also, Ikemefuna and nah. So
Mhm.
again, like, I'll try not to limit it to just Igbo culture, but I think it's also like what I have seen growing up, the male
Yeah.
child versus the female child, and the importance of being a man or a son, especially if you're
Mhm.
the only son, there is a lot of importance, that role, that position comes with, and the daughters tend to be overlooked.
Right.
In my culture, Igbo culture, if you have daughters, fantastic, but you're not
Mhm.
necessarily deemed, at least the old ways, you're not necessarily deemed a mother or a full-fledged wife if you don't have a
Something is
male.
missing. Yes.
Exactly. There's always
Yeah.
that thing, because the boy is the one that's going to carry on the father's name, so that inherits all the properties, all the land. So I
Mhm.
also see how that played a role in the way
Mhm.
both kids were treated, Nna and Ikemefuna.
Mhm.
Ikemefuna, like you said, was being primed and prepped from start to be a wife to serve. But then
Mhm.
the boy, on the other hand, was being raised to be a leader. He's
Mhm.
actually a spoiled brat. He got away with a
Mhm.
lot of things. He is a terrible person. So
Mhm.
so with the way both kids were raised and even how they are treated and how
Mhm.
they are perceived in terms of like character strength, would you
Mhm.
also say again culture or society has made
Mhm.
it that way, has enabled Inat to be the monster that he is, and has
Definitely.
okay, yeah,
So I do feel like with that, I definitely drew more from what I had seen, as a young Igbo woman, be it when I'll go back to the East and just around, relatives and whatnot. So I definitely think
yeah,
Igbo culture and Igbo people pride themselves on having male children.
mm-hmm.
You see families where they're like 100 girl child, and there's the last,
Yeah,
because you can tell they've been trying and they won't stop till they have that son. And even in the relationship, parents have to their sons versus their daughters. And maybe in their minds they're looking out for their daughters, but like the freedoms that are afforded boys, the ways the boys can get away with so much more than their
honestly,
daughters would get away with.
mm-hmm.
Boys they are coddled, like there's no other way to put it. And I think you know your parents need to have an honest conversation with what that's about. I think maybe in the past there was that whole pride of like, oh, passing on the family name, maybe the sons can also help you make money in the farm or whatever. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry, 2023, like we're all out there killing it. So I think, and yes, there's the passing on the family name, but girls can, hold on to their family name if they want to and tack on whatever.
Exactly, yeah,
It's just interesting, but I do feel like with that, I definitely drew from what I had witnessed, as an Igbo
yeah,
woman. felt like there was a clear divide and a clear lack of equality in how parents, treated their male versus female children. And there was a clear preference and pride, even when it was undeserved. And you can see that clearly with Na, where, the parents acted like his shit didn't stink. Like nothing he did was wrong growing up. Like they basically told him he was a king. And so that's why
Yeah.
he thinking he was God's gift to the world, right? Like he sees himself as this modern Renaissance man, feminist, whatever. But no, he's still full of shit. And I think it's so easy to see multiple examples of that in Nigeria, outside of Nigeria, whatever. But that was
Yeah.
definitely informed by my experiences as an Igbo woman growing up and what I had seen with how relatives and just people, Igbo people, raise their sons versus daughters.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. Parents really need to look into that. And hopefully the new generation of parents springing up, are able to pay closer
Mm-hmm.
attention to that as opposed to just treating the guys differently from the girls. But I think I
Right.
also wanted to
That's why
talk
I
about,
always Sorry, I was just going to say that's why I always just cringe when I hear, oh, it's easier to raise a male son or like a son over a daughter. I'm like,
yeah,
no, you're raising monsters. You're just not doing a good job. You just let them get away with whatever, and women
yeah,
have to deal with those repercussions. So some of those like rules and regulations that women are forced to abide by, it's like, what's the point of abiding by all of this when there's a whole other gender that gets to do whatever they want to do and we have to
yeah,
deal with. Yeah.
yeah. And then I also want us to talk about migration, and the role migration plays in tearing families apart, in shaking up people's confidence, and also Ikemefuna, obviously citing her as an example, the role of migration in her life and how that also did affect her settling in, and the way she was treated basically, because it was almost like she was treated like trash. She
Mhm,
was considered trash by
mhm,
Agbala because she came from Lagos to the US on
mhm.
their tab. So it's like, yeah, we're doing you a
Right.
favor. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. Oh my God, no. I can talk about that all day. So I think with migration, people have a very tenuous relationship with migration. I think especially coming from Nigeria, where there's always that desire to search for greener pastures outside of Nigeria. And you move to the West with so much hope and like just there's so many things you hope to achieve. And so I think with Ikeme Fina, as much as she was not down with marrying this strange man and her spirits did not agree with it, her life in Nigeria wasn't necessarily the best. Like she had to
Yeah.
deal with her monstrous father and like all the rules and regulations they placed on her. So there was a lot of hope there when she was first coming. There was a lot, I remember there was the part where she's asking her mother like, would I get to be a dancer, would I blah blah. So there was a lot of hope there, and I think a lot of immigrants can relate to that. You come here with a lot of hope, but it's always a double-edged sword because life is just like rarely ever black or white. So there's the
Mm-hmm.
dealing with the loneliness that a lot of immigrants face when they japa to this side, and with her it's times two because she's literally locked up in a house.
Yeah.
And you see the West as like this land of freedom. Freedom is a big part of like the Western story, right? Like, and especially the US. And so to come to the US and suddenly have even less freedom, I just wanted to like juxtapose this whole notion of America as the land of the free and like someone who's literally trapped. And I think that's just the reality. Like you come here with a lot of desires and hopes, but like there are also a lot of subcultures within the US. Like you could be in the US and still live such a like an insular life. And it can also be lonely in a way that being back home may not be lonely because I think there's more
Yeah.
community for immigrants back home where there are more people to turn to versus the US where it's a very individualistic, and the West in general it tends to be very individualistic. So you can be suffering and dying and like everyone is minding their business. And
Mm-hmm.
so it faced a lot of that. And I thought it was very interesting that you caught on to like this whole idea of Abala and Eke as being these benefactors who think, Ikeme Fina should be grateful for whatever they are doing for her. And I think for me that was very intentional because I find that a lot of old guards, aka people who immigrated a lot earlier and like, we're more settled or whatever, when they have new family members coming from, their homeland or whatever, they almost look at themselves as the gatekeepers, right? Like,
Yeah.
more of these people, like I have to deal with this. And so I wanted to like play with that with Agbala and Eke, where it's like, oh, they come with like a lot of rules and regulations for how Ikeme Ifena needs to exist in the US, right? And like, even when they take her out to the restaurants, right? Like, it's so easy for people to believe Agbala and Eke's side of things. Like, they're just the
Yeah.
old guard. Like, they get to control until you break free from that. I find that a lot of older Nigerians or whatever who settled here a lot earlier, look down on the newer people. It's like, like you're coming to mess with our thing. Like they've already
Yeah.
in for themselves. So it's kind of like, let's shut the gates now that we've crossed over. Like more people shouldn't come. So yeah, I just wanted to play with all of that because I think as much as the West is a beacon of hope and whatnot, and in so many ways it actually fulfills that promise. It's not like all that glitters is never gold, like fully gold, because you still deal with loneliness, you still deal with
Yeah.
racism, you still deal with all of that, and it can be harder, more challenging in certain ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. But just to quickly touch on the white neighbor. She played quite an interesting role. And I
Yeah.
think what I could sense was white savior mentality. So maybe just like
Mhm.
quickly talk about her role and I guess what the future could possibly look like for Ike Mifuna. Not necessarily a spoiler, but if there really
Yeah.
was like, a future for her, what could that possibly be?
Right. Okay. So when it comes to the neighbor, I feel like House of Man in so many ways is a very serious novel. So the racism part, it was kind of like comic relief because I think racism is very silly. It's actually
Yeah.
ridiculous. Like, so I almost wanted to like just cast it in this silly light because honestly, like racists are foolish and like just like I was very intentional about wanting it to be the comic relief. And okay, also this woman who sees herself as, a white savior, like she's looking out for them, but she's also like, there's a lot of microaggressions in the way
Yeah.
she thinks about and relates to her black neighbors, right? Like, so I don't know, like I just thought it was funny to throw that in there. I think American racism and racism in general is so silly. And there's this woman who's a white savior but is also, just full of shit. I don't know. So I really wasn't thinking that deeply because I just feel like it's so important. Like there's so much in this world that's ridiculous and hurtful and painful, and sometimes the most cathartic thing to do is to laugh at it and just to
Yeah.
expose it, the ridiculousness that it is. So that's what I wanted to do with that, because there are a lot, and I was hoping that some Karens out there who may have picked it up would see themselves in the white savior woman and like maybe check themselves a little bit. That's my
Yeah.
wishful thinking. But yeah. And then for Ikeme Fina and her path forward, or what was the question again? How she sees herself.
So what could the future possibly look like for Ike Mefuna, for Agbala, for Adina, for these people?
Right. Okay. Okay. Perfect. So for Ike Mefuna, without giving much away, I think I see Ike Mefuna as someone who would fight till her very last breath. And I love a fighter. I love someone who would always just go out guns blazing. And so I actually have a lot of faith that she'll be fine. I don't
Mm,
know how, I think it depends on how optimistic or realistic or pessimistic people are in terms of like how they see her path going forward. And I wanted each reader to like have their own experience with that, like at the end of the book. But for me, I'm very optimistic about how things would pan out for her. I believe in justice. I believe that like things would figure themselves out. She'll get to be the dancer she wants to be. So I have very high hopes for Ikeme Fana. And then for Nah, without giving much away, I am hopeful that he would be a learning experience for people. Like I'm hoping that parents who have children, people would think a little deeply about how they want to raise their sons.
yeah.
And so that's my hope for Na. For Adina, I'm always on the survivor side. It's hard because I feel like realistically speaking, you know, it's just hard for women in that situation. Like there are a lot of
Yeah.
times where it just doesn't end well when you're in it. But I don't know, like I'm an optimist true and true. So I'm always gonna be hopeful, you know, with how things ended and her being, you know, rushed to hospital. Not to give away too much. I'm hoping
Yeah.
that, you know, some charitable organization would, you know, get drawn to her situation and she can somehow get herself out of it, and, you know, become a voice for women, for survivors, down the line. And
Yeah.
who else? Agbala.
Agbala. Oof.
Oof, with Agbala. It's hard because I feel like because she's an older woman, it's just harder for people who are older to change. So as much as I would hope that with how everything pans out and, you know, some of the loss she may be facing and whatnot, she may have a moment of reflection to think about like how she could have navigated things differently. But being who she is and being the strong-headed woman, I don't see that
Hmm.
happening. So I see her charging through the world with so much rage, even more rage than she currently has.
Yeah.
I'm just wanting to fuck shit up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't see, yeah, like I don't see anything good coming out of that. I think she will double down on just all the vileness. Yeah. Is there
Yeah.
anyone else? Did I
Okay,
cover
but I feel like he's such an insignificant person
I
in the
know he's such
larger
a
picture.
follower. He would just be there in her
Yes,
shadows. Yeah,
exactly.
he's just keep. Yeah, and he will probably bear some of the brunt of her rage somehow. So yeah.
He's definitely going to.
Mhm.
Just to digress a little, what advice would you give or would you have for young writers who
Mhm.
are looking to get published or who are struggling creatively to finish a body of work, just
Mhm.
in that whole spirit of writing and just being,
Yeah.
getting to do something or being able to achieve a goal. Yeah.
Oh, I love that question. I love it. Let me think. Let me draw from my boundless wisdom. Okay, so I would say first and foremost, write what makes you feel alive.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Don't care about the market. It's so tempting to care about like, oh, is this going to sell? But I think ultimately, first of all, there's not a lot of money in writing for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so if I wasn't passionate about it, I probably wouldn't be doing it for the money. And obviously, the goal is to, you know, become someone who makes good money. But you want to love what you're doing, and you're going to
Yeah.
have ample time, God willing, after you get an agent, editors to revise, think of the market. But while you're writing, shut out the outside noise and just write what makes you feel alive, what you're actually excited to write about, like
Mm-hmm.
what actually gets you to the page. And then don't care about perfection. Like it's so hard to finish a body of work if you're like constantly trying to like make sure it's perfect. And it's hard because I know a lot of us are perfectionists, but just try to get the words out. You're going to have ample time to edit. So I think especially for that first draft, I always would tell people just write it before you start editing. Because once you start editing, before you finish that work, it will take 100 years. So you know, like you can always go back to edit. I'll rather start editing from words on page versus facing a blank page. So
Yeah.
I'd say those two advice, like write what makes you feel alive and don't worry about perfection would be what you can start with.
Thank you so, so much. Thank
Yeah.
you.